Hi, this is Dan Heisman, and we're continuing with our series of YouTube videos to help you play chess better. And today I'd like to do a little bit with evaluation, and I'd like to do it by looking at the very interesting and well-known game Spassky-Fischer 13th game 1972 match. When I talk about evaluation, the most common interpretation of that is position evaluation, but there's actually two types of position evaluations. There's static and there's dynamic. Static means you just look at the board, you count up the pieces, you see which king looks safer, you use your board vision to determine how good the pieces are, and you can kind of evaluate the position that way. Dynamic position evaluation is where you actually analyze the position for best moves, figure out what position is going to occur if both sides play their best moves, and evaluate from there. That's what computers do. They don't care about the current position. They only care about what's going to happen if both sides make their best moves. So dynamic evaluation is more important than static, but that doesn't mean that static evaluation is still not an important skill. So let's take a look at this game, and we'll catch the computer's evaluations at some points during the game and try to figure out why some side is better than the other. All right, so Spassky was white. He played e4. Fischer had just lost the 11th game, I believe, the last time he had black, by playing a Najdorf poisoned pawn. So he decided to go to one of his backup defenses, and he played the relatively rare for him, and actually rare in today's top grandmaster chess, Alyekin's defense, knight f6. And if we ask Stockfish what he thinks about the Alyekin's defense, he jumps white's advantage up to 1.33 already, which is kind of funny because that would indicate that if both sides play perfectly, black's losing already. On the other hand, one of the things that Stockfish 10 does is it tends to overestimate the player whose move it is. So for instance, if we make white's move and make it black's move, right now the evaluation is 1.4. After that move, it drops down to about 0.9 or so. So it's exactly the same thing. He was expecting e5 anyway. So he drops the evaluation. So with Stockfish 10, we have to be a little bit careful. All right, so why does Stockfish think that white is better in the Alyekin's defense? Well, obviously, white's going to set up a big center. He's going to make the knight move a couple times, although it's going to take him pawn moves to do that. White's going to use his space to have more mobility for his army. So Fischer plays knight d5, d4, d6, main line, knight f3, and now black has two main moves, bishop g4 and g6. He could also take the pawn with d takes e5, which actually Stockfish thinks that's the best move. Stockfish thinks the rare d takes e5 is the best move. So g6, still a very common move. In the book that was written on the match by Ivo Ney and Robert Byrne, Ney criticized g6 and said it was a faddish move. Stockfish doesn't think it's the best move, but it's still played today. So g6 is one of the main lines. White plays bishop to c4. Stockfish thinks that maybe either e takes d6 is okay. It thinks bishop c4 is okay as well. Bishop c4 hitting the knight. Knight goes back to b6, hitting the bishop. Bishop backs off to b3. In this position with black's move, Stockfish thinks that white's advantage is down to about half a pawn, and of course black's going to finish his fianchetto so he can castle. And again, why is white better? White has two pawns in the center on the 4th and 5th rank. Both sides are ready to castle. White has a space advantage. Stockfish thinks the space advantage is worth a little more than half a pawn. White plays knight on 1 to d2, and again, Stockfish drops the evaluation, thinks that better for white would have been to either play queen to e2, or maybe e takes d6, and we're talking an evaluation closer to 1. After knight on 1 to d2 for Spassky, it says if Fischer plays either a5 or d takes e5, he's almost equalized here. He could also castle. He castles. White plays h3, wasting a little time. Bishop g4, not really much of a threat. After bishop g4, white can always play h3 and hit the bishop anyway. So that actually causes a big difference in the evaluation. Now the evaluation of the position goes down to about even. Fischer plays a5. Anytime your opponent has a piece on b3 or a pawn, playing a5 with the idea of playing a4 becomes candidate idea. You see this a lot in master games, not so much in amateur games. Something good to remember when your opponent has something on b3, b6, g6, or g3. Pushing the rook pawn against that piece is sometimes a candidate move. Spassky plays a4. Maybe slightly better was a3. Fischer takes the pawn, best move. Spassky takes back with the pawn. Has to do that because the queen was attacking his d-pawn. And Fischer plays knight a6, a reasonable move. The idea is to bring the knight to c5 to hit the bishop on b3. White castles. Black does play knight c5, and now this pawn is attacked twice, guarded twice, but Fischer can win the bishop pair, and that's a pretty good bishop there on b3. So Spassky has to decide what he wants to do about this. He decides to let him take the bishop pair by playing queen e2. And Fischer simply plays queen e8 and says, I don't want the bishop pair, I want to win a pawn. He's got 3 attackers on this fixed pawn. There's only 2 defenders. The knight can't go to c3. So Fischer's winning a pawn, but Spassky has some compensation. He can keep the bishop pair now, and he can get ahead in development while Fischer's winning the pawn. So actually, Stockfish says a better way for Fischer to have done this is to play bishop d7 first instead of queen d8, and then he would be closer to equal. Okay, Spassky continues with his central pressure. He plays knight e4, getting out of the way of the bishop. He's telling Fischer, you can go ahead and win that pawn on a4. Fischer takes it. Knight on b takes a4. Spassky decides to give up the bishop for the knight, just to force the queen to have to guard the knight and get the knight off sides. White has some compensation for the pawn. He plays rook to e1. Probably better was to put the rook on the open file, rook to d1. Fischer gets the knight back toward the center, knight b6. Notice the general principle here is find your worst piece and make it better. Well, black has several bad pieces, but the knight, which is also a bad piece on the rim, is holding up the queen. The queen has to sit there and guard it. So unlike the other pieces, which are perfectly safe, the knight's a bad piece that needs to be flexible and needs to get away from the queen's guarding. So he plays knight b6. White plays bishop d2, hitting the a-pawn twice. Fischer saves it by pushing the pawn. So again, let's look at the evaluation of the position. White is down a pawn, and black has the bishop pair, but white has a lot of pieces in the middle of the board. He's got a rook, a bishop, and 2 knights, and black just has a fianchettoed bishop going toward the center of the board, his knight on b6s, and black's pieces are a little awkward. So white has some compensation. Is all that extra control of the center worth an entire pawn? Stockfish says no. He'd rather have the extra pawn with the 3-on-2 queenside majority. A pawn is a lot in chess. If you're ahead a whole healthy pawn and the computer evaluation is you're +1 or better, you're probably pretty close to winning. So here, Fischer's doesn't have a complete pawn ahead. White has some compensation, but not enough. So the evaluation remains black is somewhat better. White plays bishop to g5. Fischer says, where are you going, Mr. Bishop? This is called putting the question to the bishop. Very often a good thing to do. Spassky says, I want to keep the pressure on the e8, on the e7 pawn. Computer says Fischer should now play g5 with about a pawn advantage. He plays bishop f5. Stockfish says, but I can attack that bishop with knight to d4, and even though that gives up the pawn on e5, it opens up the white king. If he lets the knight on d4, take the bishop on f5. Spassky instead goes for the gusto with g4. Computer says, don't like it, that's the wrong way to go about it. Knight d4 was much, much better. Now Fischer, if he just plays bishop e6, should be winning. Fischer does play the best move. Spassky plays knight d4 too late. Fischer keeps the bishop pair and attacks the queen. Queen goes to d2 on the open file. Later on, Fischer might be able to play rook to d8, pinning the knight. Right now, he plays queen d7, which is even slightly better, freeing up the other rook. Maybe the other rook can come to d8. Spassky centralizes his rooks. Rook a d1. Here, Stockfish says a3 is pretty much winning. For instance, a3, if white trades off that dangerous pawn, black can just play rook takes a3 and get the rook in the game, hitting the pawn on h3. Fischer plays rook e8, overprotecting the e-pawn so that the queen can move in some lines. Computer says that was definitely the wrong idea. a3 was a lot better. And now Stockfish says if white plays b3, hitting the pawn and the bishop, white has full compensation for his pawn again. Spassky plays f4, aggressively playing when he's down a pawn. Probably didn't calculate that b3 was going to give him that much. It's nice to be a computer. Okay, so again, we see the evaluation jumping back and forth, back and forth. Spassky had good chances on the previous move. Now the computer evaluates the position as much, much better for black if he finds the move bishop d5. So we can see he's using dynamic evaluation. You know, Stockfish is looking 24 half moves ahead. That's 12 moves ahead. So he's looking pretty far to see what black can do. And a lot of times beginners don't like to push up their pawns in front of their king like this because they're afraid they're going to get checkmated. Well, obviously Spassky's not that afraid. He wants to use his pawns to pressure black's king. But the computer can see far enough ahead that it sees lines where after bishop d5, black has a big advantage. So Fischer finds the best move, bishop d5. Funny how some of the best players in the world tend to do that. They tend to find these computer best moves. Okay, white plays knight c5, hitting the queen. Stockfish says Fischer's best move is queen to c8, overprotecting the b-pawn. He finds that move. White plays queen c3. And now black has a choice of c6 or a3. For instance, if he plays a3 and white takes the pawn, he can play knight a4. And if knight takes a4, rook takes a4. Stockfish says black has tremendous play now that he's given back the pawn. Bishops are very strong here. In the game, Fischer plays e6 instead of c6, still within a big advantage. Spassky gets his king out of the line of fire with king h2. Again, Stockfish likes the temporary sacrifice, either a3 or c6. Fischer plays knight d7. Spassky says, I'm losing, I don't want to trade. By the way, I have an article that I wrote called Accidental versus Purposeful Errors. An accidental error is one where you try your best and you misanalyze something and you end up something wrong happens. Let's say you lose a pawn or you lose material. A purposeful error is, let's say you're in a rook and pawn endgame where you have a rook and 6 pawns and your opponent has a rook and 7 pawns, and he offers the trade of rooks, and you know when you're losing you shouldn't be trading down, especially into king and pawn endgames, unless you're 100% sure you know you have a draw. But you trade rooks and you give him a completely winning king and pawn endgame, even though you know you shouldn't trade pieces when you're losing. That would be a purposeful error because you knew you shouldn't have done it, but you did it anyway. When you're playing chess, everybody makes accidental errors. Nobody's perfect. But you want to avoid making those purposeful errors. Purposeful errors are really, really bad things to do. If you know you shouldn't trade when you're losing and you have a choice and you choose to trade anyway and then you end up losing, purposeful error. Okay, so Fischer plays c5, and now the computer says Fischer's completely dominating the board. Black has a giant advantage here of about 2.5 pawns. White plays knight b5, trying to blockade the b pawn from joining its other pawns on the queen side. And here, Fischer should grab the diagonal with queen c6 hitting that knight. And he does play that. Now Spassky needs to save the knight. He's of course going to put it on d6 where it looks like it's a wonderful outpost. The problem is his one good knight is not going to make up for all those good pieces for black. And here, in fact, Fischer can just take off that knight because the pawn's pinned to the queen, which Fischer does. Takes off the knight. Now, if Spassky doesn't want to lose an entire piece, he has to take the queen. And Fischer takes the queen. He's giving up the bishop pair, but he's messing up Spassky's pawns, and he's getting a passed pawn. Pawn takes. Here, Stockfish says Fischer's advantage is up to about 3 pawns, and he should play f6 to prevent the bishop from coming into e7 to guard the pawn. Fischer does play f6. Again, pretty good player, this guy, Fischer. Okay, Spassky plays g5. And now Fischer has several ways of locking up the game. One way is to play c4, hit the knight. Another way is to first play pawn takes pawn, and then play f5. Fischer does play pawn takes first. Pawn takes, f5. Probably c4 was a little better, but this should be good enough to win. Spassky tries to blockade the dark squares and guard his pawn with bishop to g3. Again, Fischer should just play a3 and get that pawn down there where it ties up the white army. He plays king f7 first. Stockfish says that's not necessary. Just play a3 and a2 and let the bishop guard that pawn. King f7. Spassky plays knight e5. Check. The only way to save the knight is to trade knights. Fischer has to take it. Spassky takes back. Now Spassky has a bishop opposite color endgame, so that gives him some hope that maybe he can blockade on the dark squares. The computer suggests here Fischer should play rook e d8. Fischer plays b5 first. Stockfish doesn't like that move at all. He gives a line like rook f d8. Let's say white tries to get his rook now up to h7 as happened in the game. Rook to f1. Stockfish says Fischer, in this case, should play something like king e8, rook f4, king d7, rook h4, king c6. Let's say rook h7, and then rook d7, neutralizing the rook. If instead rook h6, Fischer has a couple different ways to play this position. Stockfish likes the kind of weird move bishop f3 first, hitting the rook. He gives bishop f3, rook f1, bishop h5, trying to trap in that rook. Rook h7, rook d7 again, trading off the rooks when this a-pawn is going to win the game for black. All right, so let's get back to the game. So if we had to evaluate this position, if we did it statically, it looks like black's only up a pawn, but it's a very, very powerful passed pawn on the a file. That actually makes black's position even further ahead than 1 pawn. That's why Stockfish has black up by about 3 pawns. But also the bishop's opposite colors neutralizes that a little bit and gives white a lot of practical chances. A lot of times the computer can say you have a big advantage, but unless you find all the best moves, from a practical standpoint, it could be difficult to play. So your evaluation could be less than what the computer actually says from a practical standpoint, because nobody's going to find all these really complicated moves that give you that big advantage. So Fischer plays b5, and this is kind of the case here. Stockfish drops the evaluation about in half, from about a 3-pawn advantage to 1.5. And he says here Spassky should sacrifice a pawn to get the bishop off of the d file temporarily. Spassky plays rook f1, and now he's going in again for this idea of getting the rook up to h7 with play. Fischer should play similarly to what we just saw. Rook e d8, rook f4, king e8. If rook h4, king d7. If rook h7 check, king c6, rook c6 check, king b6, and now if rook g7, Fischer can just play rook to g8. Again, not easy to see. I think in their book on the match, Byrne and Ney didn't find this defense in analyzing the position. So they thought that, maybe Spassky was getting a little play here. Fischer decides to sacrifice the exchange to prevent the play. And Stockfish says that's completely unnecessary and jeopardizes the win and says Spassky should take the rook and try to hold on. But still says that even after Spassky takes bishop takes h8, that Fischer's clearly better. And Ney and Byrne thought that if bishop takes on h8, that would make black's job easier, and that Spassky did the right thing by not taking the exchange here. So Spassky just plays bishop f6 to guard the promotion square. He's threatening to play d7, although winning the exchange doesn't make a lot of sense because he could just take the exchange anyway. So he's not really threatening d7. So a3, rook f4, a2, threatening a1 queen. Now black finally sacks that pawn to get his d-pawn rolling. c4. Fischer plays the best move, taking it with the bishop. And Spassky counterattacks with d7. Now what would happen if Fischer gets a queen here? Let's take a look at that. If Fischer gets a queen, big mistake. Spassky would take the queen with the bishop. If rook takes, king e7, and Fischer is not even better anymore. So with the bishop and the rook guarding the a1 square, doesn't work. All right, Fischer blocks the d file again. Says you could win the exchange with d8 queen, or you could win the exchange just by taking my rook. Either way, I'm okay. I'm willing to give up the exchange here. Spassky plays king to g3. Fischer plays his best move, rook a3 check. Sometimes it's easy to miss these kind of moves. Spassky plays c3. The good news is that blocks the check and doesn't let the rook take on h3. The bad news is it takes the bishop off the pawn. And again, if Fischer gets a queen here, then rook takes, and now rook h4. Rook g1 check, king f2, rook takes h4, pawn queens, rook g2 check, king f1, rook f4 check, king e1, rook g1 check, king e2, and you could just keep checking him with a draw. So that would throw away black's advantage if he gets a queen. So Fischer instead plays the best move, rook on h to a8. Stockfish says, yes, that's the only move that gives you winning chances. White plays rook h4. This looks very dangerous. Fischer only has one move to retain a big advantage, which of course he finds. He plays e5, offering the bishop, offering the pawn. Of course, the bishop can't easily be taken without black getting a queen. But this gives the king the space he needs to run away from the checks. Spassky checks. Fischer goes king e6. Spassky checks again. Fischer plays king d6. Spassky takes the pawn, hitting the pinned bishop twice. And now Fischer plays rook takes c6 check. Spassky only has one move. All the other moves lose. King f2. For instance, if he plays king h4, black just plays rook a4 check, and it's going to be mate in a couple. All right, so king f2. So the evaluation here is extremely dynamic. You can't statically evaluate this position and just say black's up 2 pawns, so black's better, or black has a pawn on the 7th rank, black's better. And you simply can't say that white has a hanging bishop on d5. Black has a hanging bishop on d5, so white's better. You can't do that either because there's so many complications involved with the safety of the kings and whether or not either side can get a queen. And both sides have to give up material. It takes a lot of very careful calculation here. The computer says Fischer's only move is rook c2 check, which of course he plays. And now again, if he plays perfectly, he's close to winning. King to e1, best defense. And now the only move is to play king d7 and allow black to take the bishop with check. Fischer finds it again. Rook on e takes d5 check. And now his king's going to run up to the a5 square. King c6, rook checks, king b7, rook checks, king a6. And Spassky plays, he has to move one of his rooks to d2 to skewer the rook to the pawn. Fischer takes the rook. Now, of course, Spassky cannot play rook takes d2 because of it. Well, I guess he can play rook takes d2 because the bishop's on the square, but he plays the better king takes d2. And now it's tough for Fischer to win. He has extra pawns, but how does he get them rolling? The extra piece is a very good defender against the queenside pawns here because they all have to pass through these diagonal squares. So Fischer plays b5, and at this point Stockfish is dynamically looking about 26 ply ahead, and he starts to see that Fischer's having trouble winning this position, that maybe it wasn't quite as good for black as he thought it was. So the dynamic evaluation for the position is coming down to slightly less than -1, which means that with perfect play, that maybe Spassky should be able to get a draw here. And in fact, Spassky does play the best move, h4, and Stockfish says every other move pretty much would have lost. So good for Spassky. What he's trying to do is get a passed pawn here as fast as he can. But it's really a race between white's pawns on the H and G file and black's pawns here and also his pawn on the F file. So white says, you can have that extra pawn. I don't care. You got plenty of passed pawns, but I need one desperately right now. And he plays his best move, h5. Black plays c4. And now the only move for white to save the game is rook a1. Spassky finds it. Fischer takes the pawn. He has nothing better. Now Spassky can push the pawn up to g7. Should be enough to save the game. Black plays h4. White plays g7. Black plays h3. Notice that pawn's not going to win the game all by itself, because if the pawn goes in and gets a queen and the rook takes, and then he queens the other pawn and the rook takes, then if rook takes a1, then g8 queen. That's why Spassky needed this extra pawn here as fast as possible. So Spassky plays bishop to e7, threatening to block the rook out from stopping the pawn, and the rook goes to g8 to stop from being blocked in, and Spassky blocks in the rook with the bishop. So this is a good example where counting up the material doesn't give you the full story, because clearly this pawn and this bishop are completely neutralizing this rook. So you'd have to count that pawn and the bishop as being worth at least as much as the rook. But can the king and these 5 pawns beat the king and the rook over here? Well, let's see here. After bishop f8, Fischer plays h2. He needs to do that so that rook takes a2 is not possible thanks to h1 queen. Now Spassky can't do much more than move the king around, so he plays king c2. Fischer tries to get his king in, king c6. Spassky tries to block the king off of the d file. Fischer checks. Spassky says, how are you going to make progress here, Mr. Fischer? I can just move my king back and forth from b2 to c2 forever. And Fischer says, I'm going to sacrifice a pawn so that my king can come in and help my f-pawn. Spassky says, well, I have to take, and Fischer brings the king in. Spassky says, okay. Fischer pushes the pawn. Spassky checks. Fischer comes up. Spassky plays his best move, rook c1, threatening to take the pawn check and then come back. Fischer plays king to d3. And now Spassky still has a draw. What Spassky should do is like rook c3 check. If king d2, then rook takes c4, f3, rook back to c1 again, f2. Let's say rook a1. If king e2, king takes b3. If he gets a queen, rook takes, king takes, King takes a2, and this is going to be a draw. Both kings are going to come up to neutralize that. So that's what Spassky should do. He should play rook c3 check. Instead, he plays rook d1 check, and unfortunately, that doesn't work. Fischer simply plays king e2, and Spassky has no defense against Fischer just pushing the f-pawn now. He can't get the c-pawn in time because the rook can't take on c4. Now he goes back to c1, but he's losing tempos over the line I just showed you. Fischer pushes the pawn. Spassky realizes now the rook takes c4 doesn't work. He brings the bishop back. Fischer says, thank you for your only last pawn there, and now my king and my 4 pawns are going to beat the rook and the bishop. Spassky says, well, I can take a pawn. Fischer blocks the d-file. Spassky gives a check. Fischer plays king to f1. Spassky plays bishop d4. Fischer plays f2. And now Fischer is threatening rook takes, and king to e2 winning. And Spassky has no defense. For instance, king takes, rook takes, and now he's threatening to get a queen, so he can't do that. Let's say he does nothing. He plays back here. Rook takes, king here, rook checks, king f3, and that's it. For instance, if he brings the rook down, f1 is check, and black's completely winning. So in this position, there's no defense against the threat of rook takes bishop. Let's say he moves the bishop out of the way. Let's say Spassky plays bishop c5. Stockfish says the fastest win is rook checks, king takes b3, and now a1 queen. Let's say Spassky moves the bishop the other way to keep it on the square. Bishop there. Again, rook d2 check. If king takes b3, rook e2, skewering the rook to the bishop. What can white do? He has to try to stop both pawns. If he plays rook takes, king takes, pawn up queen, queen against bishop, he wins. So Spassky was right to resign here. It's hopeless. He has no defense. All right, so we've looked at one of the most famous games from the Fischer-Spassky match, a very exciting and balanced game, and we tried to put an emphasis on the position evaluation, but not just the static position evaluation. We saw in this game that the static position evaluation didn't tell the whole story in any sense. It was an extremely dynamic and balanced game where the dynamic evaluation was really the one that you needed to depend on, and that requires good analysis, because if you're not looking at both sides' best moves, then you're going to reach a position that you're going to evaluate dynamically that's not going to be the right position, and then you'll come up with the wrong evaluation. So dynamic evaluation depends on good analysis. Okay, hopefully you enjoyed today's video for my YouTube series. This is Dan Heisman. We'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.